everyone, I'm Sean Duca, the Regional Chief Security Officer at Palo Alto Networks. And today we're going to be talking about navigating the digital age, zero trust, a strategic approach to stop data breaches. So today we're joined by two esteemed guests. So first, it's Rama Vedashree. So Ms. Rama Vedashree is the CEO of Data Security Council of India. Rama, thank you very much and appreciate you being part of this today.
Thank you, Sean.
Our second guest is Vishal Salvi, joining us from Infosys. So Vishal is the Chief Information Security Officer and Head of Cybersecurity Practice for Infosys. Vishal, thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, Sean.
Today, what I really want to sort of focus on, and with my two esteemed guests, is really around that fireside chat. I mean, what we're going to focus on is really sort of breaking down and discussing zero trust, what it actually means for an organization, and really try and sort of demystify a lot of the buzz and the hype we've actually sort of seen out in the industry for at least the last couple of years. If I think about sort of breaking down the hype and the buzz around zero trust, if we cast our minds back to December of 2020, sophisticated cybersecurity attacks that ever took place in history. The exploit known as Sunburst was actually exposed in December 2020 when cybersecurity experts realized that some IT management software from a company called SolarWinds had actually been compromised. Cybercriminals used this access to inject malicious code and software into the SolarWinds software, which then in turn was sent out to thousands of customers through a software update. The key thing that we actually probably learned from this was around the defenses that organizations used and ultimately which needed to use in order to defend against this type of attack. So let's actually get into the first question as part of our fireside chat. And Rama, Vishal, I guess the question to sort of both you, and Rama will go first with you. What's the future of threats and risk? And if we start to think about SolarWinds and the breach itself, what did we actually learn from that? And what do you think is, let's call it a bit of a message that you would actually send to any organization, not just in India, but anywhere around the world?
I would like to believe that we still fully don't understand the full ramifications of that attack. We'll keep discovering that. I think the biggest learning has been the overall, supply chain risk and the third-party risks that is associated with it. Often at a country level, even, countries like US or even India, at a country level, often there might be a certain threat actor or a certain kind of compromise, which could be like a ransomware attack, where we might get predominantly overwhelmed by that, and the entire security strategy and the national security apparatus might be focused around that. But I think the SolarWinds talked about how now threat actors may be actually targeting a service provider. The service provider could be a facilities management company, a tech support company, or a large system integrator, who, if you go after that service provider, you actually get entry into so many other entities rather than actually directly trying to target a certain customer. So third party and supply chain risk, I think the ramifications of that and what we need to do to secure that supply chain risk. Because often when we looked at supply chain risk, we look at technologies, we look at, maybe devices, networks. We are not really looking at a services player being a real cog in this entire supply chain risk. That would be the biggest learning.
So Vishal, if I was to ask you the same question around what are the future of threats and risk, and what did we actually learn from the SolarWinds breach that's something we should be taking on board and using that as a learning lesson, and what did it actually teach us?
There are three broad messages. Okay, the first message is that the world is really accelerating the digital adoption, and there is a rapid adoption and acceleration of various digital technologies, and that I think is also increasing the attack threat surface, which is the second point. So basically, the rapid innovation and the speed at which it is happening, the cybersecurity world is not able to keep the pace with that, and as a result, the gap is widening between what we need to protect and the amount of controls which are actually being developed. And the third aspect of this is that there is a heightened activity, frequency, motivation, and capability of the adversaries and different types of threat actors who are constantly motivated to exploit this vulnerability and clearly the root cause of this incident was poor cybersecurity hygiene in the way in which the security was implemented for the SolarWinds CI/CD pipeline and SolarWinds infrastructure, which is why the attack happened in the first place. And one could actually deploy a backdoor in a fully legitimate whitelisted application across organizations. But I think more importantly, the software vendors would perhaps be now expected to create some level of security standards and assurance similar to what the payment card industry has done in case of PADSS, of assuring that the particular application is built on certain standards, so that organizations can choose an application which has got higher rating on security as compared to others.
Excellent, and many great points there, Vishal. I think there's probably many things that we could probably unpack from that key piece. But thank you for some great points there. So if I was to ask a question to both of you again, and this is something that I probably spend a very long amount of time and probably a constant question that probably always gets asked, which is around the basic principle around zero trust is never trust, always verify. And I think in light of what we've probably been seeing over the last couple of years, the different types of marketing campaigns have really come out from a range of different security vendors, because now finally what Forrester talked about, or what John Kindervag really sort of came out at Forrester back in those days many years ago, it's now really starting to come to fruition, so to speak. So we were seeing that sort of identity-centric approach of security coming out. What would you recommend, Rama, and I'll go to you first, how would one demystify zero trust, and what are the common pitfalls that someone should actually avoid when thinking about zero trust or embarking on a strategy like that inside their own organization?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to understand zero trust is a conceptual security architecture and framework. It's not, a product or a tool that you will buy and, you would have implemented zero trust across the company or enterprise. So it's extremely important to shift conceptually this paradigm of zero trust. That is the first shift that you need to make, because it's a different paradigm. The second one is, when you look at zero trust, I think before you start implementing zero trust, there needs to be a very good comprehensive assessment of what your current policies are, the technology stack, what is your edge looking like in the next, not just right now, in the next 2-3 years. What are all your IT assets spanning the enterprise beyond multiple cloud vendors, hybrid cloud, data center providers, right? There is so much that your digital enterprise is spanning. And what are the technologies that you have now integrated so much into your technology stack, which I think the CIO and CISO needs to evaluate. The IoT devices, how much of AI and ML have you integrated into your core business applications, right? I think a lot, and also the distributed ledger kind of thing. You need to do an assessment of where you are in terms of digital infusion into your enterprise. And then in the next 3 years, what is your digital transformation journey looking like? I think unless you do that assessment, and I think typically in zero trust, probably initially the focus would be a lot to do with users and devices and network. But I would say there needs to be equal attention to data and applications and workloads, because I think that is extremely important, because there is a certain workload and an application which has been architected for on-premise. And in your digital transformation journey, you're trying to suddenly accelerate that onto the cloud, right? Where you're probably opening it up with APIs and all of that.
Vishal, if I was to ask you the same question, how would we demystify, or, what, I guess, recommendation?
Yeah, so I think what has happened is that, as we have deployed enterprise-wide security architecture, a lot of these have now become legacy, right? So we had a problem of a traditional way of connectivity through MPLS and peer-to-peer connections, and huge amount of investments in doing so. We have a problem of scalability, because it becomes very difficult to create, get that infrastructure respond to the scale that the organization is looking for. So in a way, the control had to shift from a data-centric approach, a data center-based approach, to more of a putting all the control points on the endpoint. Now, and the last part to that is that to be able to really orchestrate those controls on the endpoints, you had to move the control point onto the cloud, so that the sensing happens on the endpoint, and the orchestration and the decision making happens on the cloud. The network and the security are converging through what we now call as SASE, right? Some other concepts can be now construed as a zero trust architecture, which will perhaps overcome these challenges, recognize this change, and create a more agile and a modern architecture, which is able to overcome these challenges and build a robust security for the future.
Some good points there, Vishal. Yeah, look, absolutely agree. I think if anything, we need to spend more time thinking about how do we link the user to the applications and the content and defining what that is. But even if you sort of take a bit of a step back, I think that the biggest thing that I would say around demystifying zero trust in my eyes would really be around the fact that it's about changing your mindset. But all up some very great points. So Rama, let me actually sort of go directly to you for this particular question that I've got. And I think for many years, we've heard terms that data is the new oil, and it's pretty much seen as that, or considered that currency of the future that's really sort of elevated the potential of what cyber risk actually means to an organization because of what they hold, because of those stores of oil that they actually have. But as the head of the Data Security Council of India, how do you see zero trust and its approach around protecting and harnessing this massive wave of data? How do you actually see that sort of really comes into play for any organization in India?
Yes. I think when you look at the entire digitization journey, particularly in India, I mean, I think the banking and financial services sector, digital payments, and the entire government to citizen services, I think these are two biggest. ITS has always been leaders in adopting IT internally because they also service, customers across the world. So we are seeing these two sectors, and of course, the entire online commerce. So when you look at data, I think one point that I can't reiterate even more now is particularly we see this states, local governments, public sector struggling in a very effective data classification strategy. Often they hold back on their decisions to move to the cloud, whether it's a private cloud or public cloud, because they've still not got their data classification strategy revisited because of the current digitization roadmap. We don't see that as a challenge in the business enterprises, but we do see that as challenges in the mid-sized firms and public sector, and particularly local and state governments. So with this, I think where zero trust can play a role is data is really central to harnessing the power of digital. While there are a whole lot of technologies, ultimately it is the data and the way the data transcends beyond the enterprise borders. There is data that is being leveraged for innovation. There's a big campaign for data for public good and social good, right? In all of this, I think it's extremely important we map it with a zero trust architecture and a strategy, not only from a perspective of user privileges, but it is also important from where that access is being requested. What is the network from which it is being request being accepted? Who is the user? I think there's a lot that needs to go into to be able to operationalize this conceptual framework. I think getting that conceptual framework and making this decision to do this paradigm shift is probably easy, but how are you going to operationalize it so that the entire data access controls within the enterprise with your partner organizations, what you're throwing it out open for startups to consume or other partners to consume through APIs that you're opening up? That's not a trivial problem given the kind of data that a digital enterprise is looking at. And another thing is a lot of this data is probably moving closer to the edge in terms of the way data is collected, processed, applications are being built, innovation is happening.
Very interesting. Some good points, Rama. So, Vishal, if I could ask you the question, and obviously as a CISO, being in a very large company, an multinational company, being Infosys, how do you actually see the role of the CISO evolving from being that risk manager to the business enabler?
The role of the risk manager continues, and also the role of a business enabler. But I think what has also got added is that the role itself has now become a business. Okay, and I'm not talking about CISOs who are kind of doing business roles also, but I'm talking about why managing risk is now adding to the top line, right? Because increasingly, um, you are in a business of assuring your customers that their business is safe with you. Okay, and so the CISOs are increasingly expected to have conversation with the client CIOs, the client CISOs, and sometimes the client CEOs to give them a independent assurance that um, in terms of how you are going to manage their business security, and why they should work with and partner with them for any of the business context that we're looking for. The topic of cybersecurity has now become a mainstream and a mainstream business problem and a mainstream business strategic problem. So the expectation out of CISO is to really now play the role of having a sphere of influence over the stakeholders. In my mind, cybersecurity is in future is going to be called digital security, and I think that's a more appropriate name for it than cyber, because eventually it's all about managing the digital risks that the organizations are facing. And so I think it's becoming more and more mainstream. It's becoming more and more strategic, and I think really the onus is on the CISOs to be able to recognize this change and play their role, and also for organization to realize that this role is no longer an operational or a technology role, but it's a business role, and it needs to have the right candidate selected for that role to really live up to its potential and expectation.
Awesome. So I like those points there. Okay, so if we
Can
were
I add a
thinking about,
couple of points?
yeah, sure, Robert, go for it.
Because we engage with CISOs across the sectors. I think the CISO is actually the one whom board is making him or her accountable for the business resilience and continuity of the enterprise, right? So I think it's not just internal operational technical role managing the risks and mitigating the risks, but the business resilience of the company and the enterprise.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So if I was to actually wrap up, I guess a couple of key things, and probably sort of take it from the point of what does Palo Alto Networks actually do, and how has it actually helped its customers and even with its partners over the last number of years, really trying to sort of implement that zero trust from partnering with us. And I think it really comes back to some of the core pieces around what zero trust is. And first and foremost, it's around identifying what's called the protect surface. And I think once you actually start to identify what those critical and most valuable things are inside the business, you actually start to build out this concept of, building a security model which is about inside out. And you start to really focus on understanding where are your crown jewels, who's actually got access to it, what's part of it, what are the dependencies around that. And from there, you can start to then create what's called pretty much a micro perimeter. If you can build a policy around using that Kipling method, that's where you can truly get that. And the part that I actually say that we at Palo Alto Networks really sort of believe in this zero trust architecture is the fact that we've been focusing on delivering this for the last 13 years at the layer 7 capability. Defining the application, defining who gets access to it, when they can get access to it, what type of content is actually there. Now, if you think about what we really sort of replaced, so to speak, was around that layer 4 firewall, that stateful firewall. And that's where you're effectively saying that address to that address, that surface, that's it. You cannot achieve a zero trust architecture by really focusing on leveraging a layer 4 firewall. That can't be the component that's actually there. But then the next key piece is once you actually start to deploy that type of a capability inside your own organization, and you start to understand who's actually getting access to it, Again, it just goes back to that simple premise. Mapping the transaction flows. Who's actually got what access to those protect services? Build out that zero trust architecture, enforce the policy, and then monitor and maintain. So constantly keep on refining and looking to see what is it that people have actually got access to, what are we actually sort of maintaining in terms of the policy, and constantly keep on tweaking and changing that. It's never a set and forget. And that's the key thing around security. Security is a constant. It's something that keeps on changing all the time, but it's something that this is something that you can build upon inside your existing infrastructure, inside your existing environments. So with that, I'd like to thank both my esteemed guests, Rama and Vishal. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you both joining me for this fireside chat today. Thank you very much.